Yeah, we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 36 tonight. Remember last week we finished up the end of Paul's first missionary journey. And of course, after that, we have in the beginning of Acts 15 there, we had the Jerusalem conference. And basically, we talked about the idea, or studied about the idea of how do you come to an agreement whenever there was really a large scale disagreement. I mean, we're not talking about a couple of individuals or a couple of families. We're talking about hundreds of miles. We're talking about numerous congregations of the Lord's body. And tonight we're going to study about another disagreement, but this one wasn't quite as big as what Acts chapter 15 was. This was actually between two individuals. And of course, probably most, if not all, you know already the story of the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. And then we'll talk a little bit about it and then get into the beginning of Paul's second missionary journey. Question number one, though, deals again with this idea of the situations that we get in when we have disagreements. And the question is, when you have a sharp disagreement, I want to emphasize that, a sharp, not just a minor disagreement, but a sharp disagreement with a friend, how do you usually handle it? We kind of talked about the idea last week. There's basically two ways that you can handle, well, maybe three, that you can handle a disagreement. What are some of those ways?
Forget about it, go the other way.
Okay, you can just sacrifice your opinion, right? Or you can sacrifice your cause or your side and say, I'm just not going to fight about it. I'm just going to give up. I'm just going to let that person have their way. That's one way to go about it. What are some other ways that you can react to it?
Clarify why you have that opinion and find out why they have their opinion.
Okay, and generally, whenever you're doing something like that, you're trying to reach some kind of agreement, right? You're trying to, maybe we could call it a compromise even, where maybe, it's not one party has to give up everything and the other one doesn't have to give up anything, but kind of a mutual agreement or a mutual sacrifice. What's another way a person could react? Okay, you could insist that it has to go your way, right? And if it doesn't, you're going to leave. And what's interesting is when we read about and study about this disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, they were both adamant this is the way it was going to be, right? There wasn't really any compromise between the two. And so it's an interesting situation, one we want to talk about, learn something about. I will want to say this, or I do want to say this, though, from the beginning. Most conflict that exists in the world today is selfish in nature and wicked in nature. Would you agree with that statement? There are some conflicts, though, that you read about in the Bible, and I don't know how you should really label them, but I'm going to call it by Paul's disagreement and Barnabas's disagreement as an honest conflict. And I want to point it out because it really wasn't something that was selfish in nature. Both of them, whenever they entered into this conflict, they weren't really thinking about themselves. They were thinking about the work of the Lord and what was best for the work of the Lord at that particular time and situation. And so we'll go over. Let's just go over to chapter 15, and if I can get somebody to read for us and read verses 36 through 41, then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
And some days after Paul said unto Barnabas, let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark, but Paul thought not good to take him with him, who departed from them from whatever that is, and went not with them to work. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches.
Okay, so this disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, what did it revolve around? Question number 2 here on your handout, what is it that Barnabas wanted to do that Paul didn't?
Want to give John Mark a second chance.
Okay, and again, kind of think about, I called this an honest conflict in the beginning because these are two guys that the idea was brought up. Let's go back and revisit, all these congregations. Remember on the first missionary trip, they went to all these different places, established all these congregations. Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back and revisit these congregations. Let's strengthen them and let's edify them. And did they both think that was a good idea?
Yes.
Yeah, there was no disagreement on that part. I mean, both of them thought that was a great thing to do. They knew it was the Lord's work. They were genuinely concerned about these people and about these congregations, and they both wanted to help. They both wanted to strengthen them in any way that they could. The difference between them, though, was how best to carry out that work. We might say the method, or more specifically, we might say the people who should be involved in this work. And so Barnabas thought that they ought to take John Mark with them again. Now remember, John Mark went with them on the first missionary journey, right? And what happened in the middle of that journey? Yeah, he departed and he went back to Jerusalem. And so there was I guess you could say in Paul's mind, there was a question about, well, can we rely upon this guy? Who's to say he gets in another difficult situation and he doesn't do the same thing again? Is this the best person to choose for us to bring along and to do this very important work? Now, Barnabas, I think we mentioned before, but Barnabas was flesh and blood to John Mark. That may have had a little bit of bearing on why he wanted to bring him along, but they did share a physical relationship. They were part of the same family tree. And I think that Barnabas knew that John Mark was recommitted. John Mark obviously wanted to go, right? I mean, I think it's safe to say that he wasn't lobbying for something that John Mark didn't want to do. John Mark expressed interest. He wanted to go on this second missionary trip. And Barnabas, he felt like he deserved a second chance. And so stop and look at it from Barnabas' standpoint, and would you say that he had a good point or a good argument?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't really have anything that I could say bad about it. Okay, so you have Barnabas' take on the situation, and then on the other hand, you have Paul. And remember what they're doing here. They're revisiting very young Christians. Okay, they're revisiting relatively new congregations. These haven't been established for decades or anything like that. And so think of it from the standpoint of Paul. You're going out here, you're trying to strengthen these people, you're trying to encourage them. And so what kind of people do you want to bring along with you?
Strong.
You want to bring along a quitter? Do you want to bring along a person who deserted, ran off whenever the going got tough? I mean, maybe in Paul's mind here he's saying, this isn't such a good choice to try to influence these young Christians and teach them the proper way. Yes, sir.
Is there an explanation of why that happened in the first place?
No, we're not really told why. We're just told he left and went back. And so I think when we kind of looked at that, we kicked around a few ideas, possibilities, but as far as exactly what it was, I don't think we know for sure. But it must have been, looking at it, reading between the lines maybe, looking at it from Paul's perspective, it must not have been a good explanation because Paul wasn't ready to take him along again. There must have not have been an unavoidable departure. Yes, sir.
Was Mark the one, was there somebody who fled naked from the deal? That was also considered Mark, was it?
Yeah, a lot of commentators believe so. He's not mentioned by name, but
Mark, is it?
yeah. So That could be kind of a pattern if that was the case, right? Yeah. But yeah, that's an interesting study. You can go back and look at that a little bit more. So, you think about it from Paul's perspective. Did Paul have some good points? Yeah, I mean, when you study Paul, we talked a little bit about it, I think last week or the week before, I guess it was last Sunday, and as Dennis was teaching the first part of the book of Acts there. But Paul was a guy, when he went to do something, he was all in. He was committed, and he wanted people like that alongside with him. And so here he is, and remember, he's relying upon these people a lot as they go out in these situations. He's counting on them to be able to help out, to do things, and to help this work go smoothly. And so he didn't know that he could count upon John Mark. He'd already proven himself unreliable in the first missionary trip, and so he wasn't ready to just jump right back on board and say, well, yeah, let's go ahead and take him again.
Would there have been a reason that maybe he didn't complete the journey with him, like Paul might have had some trouble along the way on his trips, like beating stone and stuff like that?
Yeah, if you traveled with Paul, you got more than your money, I guess. you saw a lot of difficult things. And, he was a young guy, too. He wasn't like he was an old man who'd been around the block and seen everything. But there's probably some things that happened on that missionary trip that were pretty startling, especially to a young person. So you have this, again, you have these two guys. They have a good desire. They both want to do this good work. They want to help out. Their motives for choosing who they chose is not necessarily selfish in nature. Would you say that? I think they both have good intentions. And, Barnabas is wanting to help out John Mark, and he's wanting to allow him the opportunity to prove himself worthy. And Saul is saying, that's just a chance we can't take, on this. But this is an important trip. We're doing some important work right here, and we've got to have people that we can count on and rely upon. And so it's one of those situations where they just couldn't agree. They couldn't work out a remedy. They couldn't compromise. And so the only solution that they could come up with is Barnabas takes John Mark, and he goes and he revisits some of these places, and Paul's going to take Silas, and he's going to go and revisit some of these places. Now, I often talk about, the fact that sometimes man has these plans, and man views the history of the world as it's happening through his eyes. God uses this as a tremendous opportunity. There's at least three positive things that I can see that come out of this. Number one, you have John Mark reestablished, because of this. Because Barnabas takes him, Paul later on in his epistles writes about how he's worthy. He's proven himself. He's good for the ministry. He would commend him. You also have Silas entering into a new work. If this division hadn't happened, Silas now becomes Paul's worker and traveling companion. And so he actually begins the start of a new missionary journey for him. And then you also you think about it, you have two groups working at the same time. And so you're actually getting twice the amount of work done in a shorter amount of time by doing these things. And so it goes back to one of these principles that we talk about or mention from time to time. Sometimes the intentions of man, God can use man's plans to his good, to bring about good to his advantage. And I think that's one of these situations that we read about here. So what do they do about their difference of opinion? Well, they decide to go their separate ways, right? Now, did they quit talking to each other? They start calling each other names behind each other's backs, stuff like that. No, that's not the kind of disagreement that we're looking at here, right? In fact, when Paul writes the letter of 1 Corinthians, he talks about Barnabas there. Talks about him in 1 Corinthians, I think it's 1 Corinthians 9 or 2 Corinthians 9. He talks about him and how he's to be used as an example. Later on, he writes about the usefulness of Mark, in the ministry. And so it wasn't an argument. Now, understand, there was a sharp disagreement There was a great difference in opinion between what they thought should have been done, but it didn't destroy their friendship. It didn't destroy their relationship. And so they depart and they both go their separate ways on that missionary journey. All right, so anybody have any thoughts or comments there on that disagreement? Again, it's a little bit smaller scale than the one we studied about last week in the first part of chapter 15. So let's go over to chapter 16 and let's talk a little bit about Timothy as he joins this second missionary journey in the midst of it with Paul and Silas. So if I can't get somebody to read verses 1 through 5. Acts 16, 1 through 5.
Then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. He would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in the quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. As they went through the cities, they delivered them to the priests for to keep, that were obtained of the apostles and the elders which were at Jerusalem. And so were the churches established in the faith, and increased in number daily.
Okay, so we read about Timothy here, and one of the first things that we learn about are the parents of Timothy. And who were the parents of Timothy? What are some of the things you can tell me about? Let's start with his mother. What can you tell me about Timothy's mother?
She believed.
Okay, she was a believer, right? She was a Christian. What else can you tell me?
Her name was Eunice, and she was a Jew, and along with her mother, because it was a grandmother, he was taught the word. They were very faithful.
Yeah, and so Danny's digging deeper here than the book of Acts, but that's good because that's what we want. Actually, when Paul wrote 2 Timothy, he mentioned those things that Danny brought up there. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5, he talks about, of course, his mother, or his grandmother Lois, his mother Eunice, and also I think it's over chapter 3 and verse 15, he says that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures. Well, who taught him those? Would have been his mother and his grandmother, right? And so we learn about his mother. She was what nation was she? What nationality? She was a Jew, right? But she was a Christian. And she had taught Timothy from a small boy the Scriptures. And not only she, but also his grandmother obviously had a part, and as Paul wrote in the first part there of 2 Timothy, had a part in his rearing. And so here you have Timothy. His mother and his grandmother had a great influence upon him. But what do you know about his father?
He has a good reputation. He's a Greek that has a good reputation.
Okay, well, I think actually the good reputation has to do with Timothy, doesn't it? Am I reading that wrong? Trying to find my place here.
But his father was a Greek, which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. Maybe I misunderstood that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go with it. It applied to Timothy, and I'll explain a little bit as we go here. His father was a Greek. What does that tell you?
He was uncircumcised.
Okay, his mother was a Jew, right? His father was a Greek. His mother was a believer. Was his father a believer?
Say not.
No. There's no mention of him being a believer. When Paul wrote 2 Timothy, there's no mention of his father, instilling a faith within him. It was only his mother and his grandmother that Paul mentions there in that epistle. And so Timothy came from a divided spiritual family, right? His mother was a faithful Christian. His grandmother was a faithful Christian. His father was not. He was just a Gentile. I don't know how far down that road we should pursue it, but he was not in a saved condition. We can safely say that. So here's Paul, and he's traveling. They come to Derbe and Lystra. And it's interesting in verse 1 there of chapter 16, King James Version, I think, translates it, behold, or New King James Version translates it, behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy. That word behold means to stop and to consider, to stare, to gaze, to look upon. And what it's emphasizing to us is that Timothy was an extraordinary young man. You know, he was not like everybody else who was his age. And again, that's reflected, I think, in what Paul writes about him in the book of 2 Timothy, but also the fact that Paul wants him to go along with him, doesn't he? Now again, think about the kind of people that Paul wanted to go on these journeys. He'd already didn't want to take John Mark, you know, because he was concerned that John Mark wasn't going to stick it out or might not stick it out again. But he runs into this young man by the name of Timothy, and Paul's impressed by him. You know, and in fact, in verse 2 there, he was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. You know, this guy was an extraordinary young man. It wasn't just, Paul wasn't the only one who noticed it. It was all the brethren. You know, they all were on board when it came to Timothy. And so, because Paul was impressed with him, we read there in verse 3, he wanted him to go on with him. But there was something that Paul wanted to do. Question number 5. He had Timothy circumcised. And this kind of brings up an interesting discussion, because we know, we go through the writings of Paul, and Paul's, Acts chapter 15, he's argued against it, right? He says, no Gentile needs to do this in order to be saved. Circumcision doesn't matter. It doesn't help anybody in the sight of God. It doesn't hurt anybody. So why would Paul do that? Why would he have Timothy circumcised?
Because of the people that he was going to be meeting.
Yeah. Paul, remember, wherever Paul goes in all these cities, where's the first place he goes?
Synagogue.
To a synagogue. We know that Timothy's father was a Gentile. Okay? And Timothy himself has not been circumcised, even though his mother is a Jew, and even though she's a Christian. Do you think Jews would let Timothy walk into the synagogue not being circumcised? Do you think they would listen to him? Do you think they'd say, hey, why don't you come up here and talk to us a little? No. And this was what Paul did. Right? This was his custom wherever he went. The first group of people that he tried to reach out to were the Jewish people. And so he knew if Timothy was going to be effective, in converting these Jews, he was going to have some Christian liberties, taken away from him, just so that he would have an opportunity to speak to these people. Otherwise, they were not going to even listen to him. And so it's interesting. Again, you go back to Galatians chapter 2, and you read about Titus. Remember Titus? He was a Gentile too, right? Paul would not allow him to be circumcised. Why? Do you remember the story?
That would be a concession to the Judaizing teachers.
Yeah, because the Judaizers were saying, you have to do this in order to be saved, right? Now, understand the difference between doing something to benefit and to be helpful, which is what Paul was doing with Timothy, versus giving in to somebody who's saying you have to do this in order to be saved. There's a difference between the two situations. And so, just because the way Paul operated, it was almost necessary. If Timothy was going to be effective with the Jews at all, it was necessary for him to do that. And so, Paul went ahead and did that in order for him, again, to be helpful in that missionary journey. Not because it was a necessity, right? And even when you look back, we could get into a pretty deep discussion, but when you look back through the pages of the New Testament, there were still guys who were following the Jewish tradition, right? Not because they thought you had to be saved, it was just because they were Jews. And this is what Jews did. This was their heritage. This was their tradition. And so, again, Paul knew it didn't matter when it came to salvation, but he also knew if he was going to be effective in what Paul was doing, this was something that needed to be done. And so, again, you can look at Galatians 2, 3 through 5. You can read about Titus there. Also, 1 Corinthians 6:12 talks about the idea of becoming a slave or a master to somebody else. But Timothy does join this missionary journey, and of course, again, some of these Christian liberties are taken away from him in order for him to be effective in this ministry. And obviously, it wasn't against Timothy's will. Timothy didn't have a problem with it. He's an extraordinary young man. So we read about them. They're going through, let's see, Derbe and Lystra. And then let's read verses 6 through 10 here in chapter 16 for us. Well, there's a lot of names in there, aren't there? There's a lot of cities. So let's just summarize. They're going through these different places, right? They're revisiting some of these congregations. They're wanting to go into the area of Asia, but they're forbidden by the Holy Spirit to do that. And so they take a different route. They end up coming to Troas, and in verse 9, at Troas, Paul sees a vision in the middle of the night. A man of Macedonia stood, pleaded with him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And so now, after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. It's kind of interesting when you read about these situations. How did Paul and these men determine where they were going to go? God basically guided them through these missionary journeys, didn't he? Now, did they have a plan? Did they have things that they wanted to do in their mind? Yeah, they had areas that they wanted to go, but they didn't always get to go to those places. And so we read about God intervening in some of these plans that they had. Question number 6 here on your handout is, how did God guide these missionaries in their travels? Okay, one of the ways we read about there in verses 9 and 10 was a vision, right? We just read back in verse 6, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. After they come, verse 7, after they had come to Mysia, they tried to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit did not permit them. And we're not told how they were forbidden, but we're just told the Spirit of God intervened and they weren't allowed to go where they had planned to go. So it's interesting, you're reading about through these travels, you know, God is intervening from time to time. Obviously, the vision is a miraculous vision, but He's helping guide them to the preaching, to the places He wants them to go to preach the gospel. And it's kind of interesting when you think about the way that it worked out here with Philippi. So, question number 7, what did Paul see in a vision? He saw that Macedonian person standing on the far shore, begging him to come and to help. Why do you think God kept them from going to certain places? Right? They made these plans. They had in their minds places they wanted to go and preach the gospel, and they were probably places where they hadn't been before, right? So why do you think God basically said no, or redirected them to go somewhere else? Okay, that's a good thought, isn't it? Was Paul's life ever in jeopardy on any of these missionary journeys? Yeah, more than once. And so maybe God miraculously intervenes, redirects their route, because He knows if they go there, Paul's not coming back, you know, or somebody's going to get killed or hurt. Any other reasons you can think of?
Well, since we're looking at the way God works, there was not only Paul out doing the preaching, there was 11 other guys going, and they may have had it covered, who knows? I mean, you know, we don't know anything about any of the rest of them, but as far as biblically, but they did disperse from Jerusalem and went many different directions, and so maybe they're covered another way, and Paul, being a Roman citizen, best thing to do is keep him in the center of the Roman Empire.
Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. The Bible doesn't really tell us why God did it, but, you know, there was a reason. God had a plan, you know. It wasn't just randomly here and there. God didn't want them to go and say, you know, don't go there. There could be any number of things that maybe that region wasn't ready yet. I mean, maybe it wasn't prime, you know, to hear the gospel of Christ. Maybe some few things needed to happen there before the people were going to be really receptive to the preaching of the gospel. So any number of reasons could happen. But we have to understand and trust, just like Paul and his people that went along with him, God knew what was best, right? And so they went where God told them to go. And so God sends them this vision, this Macedonian man, and they set out to go into the area of Macedonia. The first place they arrive, of course, is in Philippi. And let's just read real quickly here. Somebody read verses 11 through 15 of Acts 16 here.
Which we're losing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, and the next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony, and we were in that city abiding certain days, and on the Sabbath we went out of the city by a riverside, where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which reported thither, and a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Tyre, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, and she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, if we have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us.
Okay, so we mentioned Paul's custom. Where does he usually go when he goes to these cities? Where's the first place he goes? To the synagogue. But here he goes to a river where prayer is customary for prayer to be offered there. Why did he go there instead of to a synagogue? Yeah, evidently they didn't have a synagogue. You know, does anybody know? Probably studied before, but what were the requirements for a synagogue in a city? Does anybody know?
I don't know how many people, but there had to be so many people.
Yeah, you had to have at least 10 Jewish males to have a synagogue before the Jews would allow or authorize a synagogue to be built within the city. Do you read about any men here at this river? No, it's just a group of women, right? And so they're meeting out here by the side of the river. They customarily came together. They prayed there. And so Paul uses that opportunity. Philippi, again, God is redirecting their course. They go to Philippi. Philippi is a pretty interesting stop along the way. One of the major Roman roads ran through the city of Philippi. In fact, it's known as the Nation Way, if you know what that is from studying a little bit of Roman history. But interesting thing about Philippi was like a miniature Rome. I mean, they were a Roman colony, and there were a couple different ways that a city could be authorized or recognized by Rome as a Roman colony. One of the ways is you basically had to mimic Rome. You had to stick with Roman law, you had to stick with Roman dress, Roman customs, everything. And that's the city of Philippi. It's like this miniature Rome. And so Paul goes there and he preaches the gospel there, converts Lydia, and if you read a little bit later on in verses 20 and 21, you'll see a little bit of their idea of sticking to Roman law. They were Romans, and Paul was teaching things that was contrary for them to do according to Roman law. But it's an interesting choice by God. Obviously, a major gateway to Europe, and so a very important city in spreading the gospel, not only in Macedonia, but well beyond the borders of Macedonia. So question 9, who opens Lydia's heart? Yeah, in verse 14 it says the Lord opened her heart, right? Does God open our hearts today? Yeah, the question is not if, the question is how. How did God open Lydia's heart? How was her heart open? Yeah, through hearing the word of God, right? She listened to what Paul had to say, and when she heard what Paul had to say, her heart was open. She obeyed the gospel of Christ. Of course, that's the way that God opens our heart today. And what does she do? What does she and her household do? Yeah, they're baptized. When your heart is opened by God, when you listen to what God has to say, are you going to be baptized? Absolutely. And so, think about what Paul was teaching these people too. It wasn't a comprehensive dissertation on the laws of the New Testament. It was just some basic, fundamental, easy things that everybody needs to know before you obey the gospel. One of the things that he taught was baptism. So that tells you a little bit about the importance. A lot of people, a lot of debate in the religious world today about the place and the significance of water baptism, but you read through the book of Acts, you'll find it was significant. It was part of the basics, the essentials, the introduction to the gospel that Paul taught people. So he converts her. You'll read the rest of the chapter. We're trying to cover too much here, but Paul and Silas are put into prison, and of course the Philippian jailer is converted because of that. Now, remember that Paul and Silas had been punished and imprisoned without a trial. And that was important. Why? Paul was a Roman citizen, and it was illegal to do anything to a Roman citizen without a trial. And so it's interesting, when the people learn about this, they kind of back off, and it opens a door, really, for Paul, an opportunity for Paul to work in Philippi, because if they do anything to him, they got this hanging over his head where, hey, you beat me and put me in prison and I'm a Roman citizen. So they just kind of backed off and let Paul do his thing, and the church enjoyed some great success in the city of Philippi because of that. All right, we're out of time. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions, anything before we end?